There's a new case and a half each day in New York City alone. Do you know what it's like to have 18 of your own friends in a year and a half die? Men who are at the height of their creative usefulness to society, all men under 50 years old. In 1 year, I am asked to live with the kind of problems, or problems is the wrong word, experiences that my mother at 84 years old is now having to learn to live with when her friends are dying, and I am only 47 years old. Now, I don't think the straight community has any concept of what it's like to be a gay man in this city. It's like living in wartime. You don't know when the bomb is going to fall. Who's it going to hit next? A friend of mine that I had dinner with 2 months ago, 3 weeks ago, checks himself into the emergency room of St. Vincent's Hospital, and in 10 days is dead. He seemed perfectly healthy. What is this mysterious thing that is in who? Do I have it?
On June 5th, 1981, the CDC reports that Kaposi's sarcoma is rising in gay men. At first, it is called gay cancer, but the name is soon changed to GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency. By January of 1982, there were 394 reported cases of GRID and 163 deaths. By November 1982, it is officially declared an epidemic and the name is changed to AIDS, or Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. In 1983, the retrovirus that causes AIDS is isolated from a Parisian fashion designer. This retrovirus is named Human Immunodeficiency Virus, or HIV.
So people were aware that something bad was happening, but no one really knew for sure why it was happening. And so there were two responses. One was to deny that whatever happened to you. The common response among gay activists was, look, more gay men are going to die in a car accident, they're going to get AIDS, so just go on and live your life and don't get depressed by it. The other response was to sense that this was something that was growing and it was something you couldn't turn away from, but because you didn't know how to deal with it or what to do about it, you just went into total denial. And that went on for many years. I mean, we tend to write our histories in terms of heroes and villains, but people are not so black and white. I mean, there were problems with getting gay men to open up and wake up and face what was going on, and a lot of people just didn't want to hear it. But then there was the other side, the brighter side, which was that gay men organized right from the start. In 1982 in New York City, we formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis. In San Francisco, which was a much more community-oriented, queer community, organizations that were already in place, changed what they did to focus on AIDS or to include AIDS issues. And so there were very early activist responses and community-based responses to deal with what was going on. And the biggest hurdle wasn't just the right-wing media and the right wing. Their biggest hurdle was to get gay men to say, hey, you better wake up. Something serious is happening and we need to figure out what's going on and we need to do something about it. They had power because a lot of the Republican Party was their home base. Mm-hmm. And the Republican Party had more money than the Democrats. They had more powerful business interests behind them. And so it was very easy for them to get a platform, and a national platform, to speak out against gay rights. And that was all brewing when AIDS started to unfold.
They're made out of mud. I was like...
Oh yeah, mud. That's bad.
They're made out of...
One thing that gay men learned from feminists in the women's movement was that the medical establishment had never cared about minorities, never cared about people of color, women, queers, and in fact, there was a long history of them brutalizing us. So what we did was, because we didn't trust the medical establishment, the early activists and radicals said, let's find community-based solutions. So some of the earliest gay men diagnosed with AIDS in San Francisco became public speakers, took pictures of their symptoms and their illnesses and put it on gay storefronts and said, if you ever see this on your body, you should contact this number or call me because I think you might be a part of this health crisis. In New York, I was part of the earliest response. I mean, GMHC was basically to help a caring organization, help people who are sick get groceries, help them check into hospitals. I mean, basic things that people needed. They didn't want to be controversial. They didn't want to be political, as if anything isn't. And so there was a lot of work, aside from GMAC, that needed to be done. So in our discussions, we dared to say that in the 1970s, after Stonewall happened, we may have gotten carried away with a little too much sexual freedom. And as a result of that, many sexually transmitted infections began to explode. This is the little booklet that changed the world. This was the invention of safe sex. Mm-hmm. But for me, I had about 4 sex lives when I was 23. And I realized that there were many other ways that people could be sexual and still protect each other. That not everything was a risk, that there were ways of minimizing your risk, that there was a way to give people the freedom to keep having sex if you taught them how sexually transmitted infections are transmitted from one person to another. By the time Active came along, it was 5 years into the epidemic, women were being affected, IV drug users were being affected, the population expanded beyond gay men, and now it was time to really, it was becoming so huge that people felt we have to get the government to respond no matter what it takes. And ACT UP engaged in civil disobedience, and ACT UP was a game changer because they really put the issue of people with AIDS being disposable on the national radar. And that changed everything.
Do you think you've really accomplished a great deal?
Yes, I think we do. What else can we do? I've done everything. I've called everybody. I got appointments with everybody. I've got to come to City Hall and state my case. We're dying. The city is dying.
People like Larry Kramer gave speeches demanding a government response, and the government timidly allowed people with AIDS to testify in Congress, to give input into how the community felt the government could help with the crisis that was emerging. But it wasn't until ACT UP came along with very angry voices that things started to change.
If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from Jesse Helms. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the President of the United States. And especially if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows which are interested in me as a human interest story only as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the fact that not enough rich, white, heterosexual men have gotten AIDS for anybody to give a shit. You know, living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends. But nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare. And only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. No one else seems to be noticing.
And they finally found drugs that were effective against HIV around 1995, 1996. And that really stemmed the tide. I mean, one of the huge disasters of the AIDS epidemic before the drugs came around was ACT. Mm-hmm. It was a highly toxic drug. There was plenty of research showing that it was dangerous to use this drug in the way that it was being recommended to gay men with AIDS. There were voices in the community saying, we know people are desperate for something, But, why should we become guinea pigs with a highly toxic drug when we don't know what the long-term effects are? So there was this huge, divide in the community over ACT. And as it turned out, most of the people that the community convinced to take ACT, it hastened their death and they suffered terribly. We have to see AIDS as part of a larger picture of American health and work to make sure that everyone has access to decent care and can afford it. And to me, that's like the most important issue right now. Not only will that impact AIDS, it'll impact everything. Activists did address, the issue of access to decent and affordable health care.
The AIDS epidemic continues to have a huge impact on the present day. Up to this point, there have been millions of deaths due to AIDS, and AIDS is prevalent all over the world. However, it is not just the disease that is still prevalent. The activism of the 80s and 90s laid the foundation for so much activism that we see today, as well as gained so many rights for the queer community. That being said, there is still more work that can be done for AIDS activism. Overall, it is clear that AIDS is still a huge issue, and while a lot of progress has been made, we're not finished yet. It is important to take note of how we got to this point to see how we can move forward.
Part of the tragedy of AIDS is that a lot of the people who decided to live a life that was outside the mainstream and who had really brilliant ideas for how, life in America could be better, also saw sexual freedom as part of that vision and were the first to be lost. We thought people would never forgive us for AIDS, and in fact, they've embraced a lot of our ideas and a lot of our trailblazing in issues of sexuality and gender.